Well, thank you tremendously, Mickey and Michael and Frida, and for inviting me here, and everyone for coming. It's been a wonderful visit so far. I'm just going to begin in a movie theater. Movie theaters invite out-of-body experiences. This was certainly the case for me at the New England Aquarium's IMAX Theater, watching a movie called Volcanoes of the Deep Sea, a documentary about hydrothermal vents produced in 2003 by James Cameron, the director of Titanic and Avatar. Hydrothermal vents are undersea locations where superheated chemicals emerge from Earth's crust, from fractures in the sea floor, nourishing a variety of unusual creatures, like the undulating tube worms that are featured at the center of this image here, which are capable of living without sunlight. In 1979, these abyssal ecologies were discovered to host heat-loving microbes, hyperthermophiles, that make their living not through photosynthesis, that is, not through capturing energy in the form of light, but rather through chemosynthesis, the production of organic materials using energy from chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide, endemic to mid-ocean vents and poisonous to most organisms in the sea or on land. In a spectacular opening sequence in this movie, and don't worry, I'll show you a little bit of this movie, Volcanoes of the Deep Sea lifts the IMAX audience's vision into a helicopter eye view of the open ocean. We race across the surface toward a distant ship. Actor Ed Harris, who starred in Cameron's science fiction movie The Abyss, narrates, quote, "The research vessel Atlantis. Destination, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge System, 500 miles ahead and 12,000 feet down," unquote. We are introduced to the deep-sea submersible Alvin, deployed from Atlantis over the last 40 years or so to survey the submarine world. Atlantis is the small kind of washing machine-like thing that's hanging from the A-frame at the back of the Atlantis ship. With our vision routed through the vantage point of the three-person Alvin submarine, we are escorted into the deep to see volcanic chimneys that sit thousands of feet below the surface, spewing superheated minerals into ambient water, deep-sea volcanoes. A voiceover primer on vents follows, again in Ed Harris's voice, which I don't have, but I'll imitate. Quote, "Water descending into fissures in the seafloor was apparently interacting with the hot rocks beneath to reemerge as a black cocktail of poison chemicals. The submarine's temperature probes indicated water hot enough to melt lead, and it was heavily laden with hydrogen sulfide. There should have been nothing alive here at all," unquote. But there was. The film zeroes in on ecologies of tube worms and shrimp, links in what New York Times science writer William Broad calls the dark food chain. Harris's narration lingers on a vent covered with tube worms sprouting red petals, like those, I guess. He says, quote, "Scientists were astonished to discover that tube worms' red color comes from blood containing hemoglobin, very much like our own," unquote. Inviting our amazement, he asks, quote, "So who are these fantastic creatures of the dark who share with us the very blood that flows through our veins," unquote. The movie is bent on connecting vent creatures to humans through a history of our shared substance and common descent, restaging in a scientific idiom narratives of lost worlds and primeval others as foils for and sources of fully human identities. The origin story in the film reveals much about the presumed values and anxieties of the movie's European and American target audience. And it makes explicit the social anchors of the marine biology that I followed as an anthropologist. I stopped to take in this film during fieldwork among microbiologists who study deep-sea creatures, and I want to use this movie as a leaping-off point to talk to you about that work. to explore what this genre of marine biology dedicated to mapping the limits of life means and how it's given broader cultural meaning. Before I say more about the movie, let me outline a little bit about the anthropological project that I undertook for the book Alien Ocean, which you saw held up earlier and which is circulating somehow. Marine biologists' visions of the ocean are today in transformation, a transformation that, in my book, I tracked primarily in the United States, working alongside scientists at research centers from Massachusetts to Hawaii, in laboratories, at sea, and online. Marine biologists are learning to see the sea not only as the home medium for marine mammals, fish, and seaweed, but also as a realm inhabited, maintained, and modulated by an extraordinary mix of microbes, many of which thrive at extremes of light, temperature, pressure, and chemistry. Marine microbiologists increasingly describe their field as microbial oceanography, a phrasing that makes mapping microbial life coincident with mapping the sea itself, that suggests that microbes are not just in the sea, but that microbes are the sea. Marine microbes are becoming fresh scientific tokens for the life that the sea is considered to substantiate and symbolize. If the whale was a key figure for the 19th century sea as a symbol of work, trade, and natural history, and the dolphin, one emblem of the 20th century sea, as a mascot for environmental science and inspiration, marine microbes are being readied for their 21st century turn on the stage of scientific apperceptions of the ocean around us. For example, the International Census of Marine Microbes, which depends upon sequencing the DNA of these very smallest creatures in the sea, provides one example. The United States National Science Foundation-supported Center for Microbial Oceanography, known as CMOR, get it? Promises that sequencing the DNA of marine microbes will reveal, quote, the genetic basis of marine microbial biogeochemistry, unquote, which is a really interesting locution, right? The genetic basis of marine microbial biogeochemistry. It suggests that the ocean has a genome, right? That that the ocean can be sequenced, much in the way an organism can be sequenced. That subtending global climate is a genome. Sometimes scientists call this a metagenome or an environmental genome. MIT microbiologist Penny Chisholm calls what's going on in marine biology these days a paradigm shift, borrowing the term, of course, from our friend Thomas Kuhn, a move from sounding seas of creatures to reading networks of genes. So one of the privileges of doing anthropological fieldwork among scientists is that I can use their PowerPoint slides as evidence in my own PowerPoint slides. So, but let me get back to this movie. Volcanoes of the Deep Sea takes us on a scientific mythological vision quest into the underworld. And so I'm going to see if I get this properly to work. You're going to hear Ed Harris. This is the sort of part of a deep sea volcano. You're going to hear the voice of Ed Harris narrate us into the earth. So here we go.
Chemosynthetic bacteria, it turns out, were not just growing on the rocks, but on the shrimps themselves. The shrimp are coated in a slimy layer of bacteria, which they scrape off and eat. The shrimp seem to fight for position in the hot water in order to feed their coat of bacteria. When scientists began to look beyond the obvious feeding patterns of the animals and probe deeper into the chimney walls themselves.
So we're going into the volcano.
They made perhaps the most astonishing discovery. In total breadth of the inner Earth, at 3,500 pounds of pressure per square inch, and temperatures exceeding 230 degrees Fahrenheit, lives the microscopic hyperthermophile. We did not even think to look here for life. There is no harsher environment on Earth. There is no creature more alien to us. Yet as we journey down deeper among the molecules of its DNA, we reach the 4 base chemicals of life's universal alphabet. This is the language of human DNA, and in this we are most certainly related. There is a good chance that this is where life began on Earth, and here among the embers of that long ago dead star is where we began our journey 5 billion years ago.
You do realize that was a combination of documentary footage and computer graphics of various sorts. What's happening? So in this clip that I just showed you, the rhetoric works like this. So after our encounter with these creatures that are alien to us, these computer-generated blobs with tendrils that look like antennae, like umbilical cords separated from the walls of their womb-like thermal environment, the story twists, flipping the script of strangeness into familiarity, guiding our vision into the body of one of these extreme-loving microbes, zooming in on its naked genes, its DNA, posited as a universal kinship substance. From the blood of tube worms to the genes of hyperthermophilic microbes, we travel back in time, taking a detour into the nearly alien to arrive at a genetically imagined kinship with the deep, spelled out in the metaphorical language of DNA. Volcanoes of the Deep Sea advances the claim that genetic classification will reveal our true relations, our true ancestors, and will press us to acknowledge our long-lost cousins, today's hyperthermophiles. It delivers a moral demand right out of Dickens to accept our connections to the lowliest branches on our family tree. And it summons us to this responsibility through painting the deep sea as a motherly nursery for life on Earth. In this story, Earth's ocean becomes uncanny, a homely matrix that upon close investigation turns out to harbor aliens, which then turn out to be part of us. And I'm fascinated by this deep-sea alien, this strange watery familiar, and intrigued by what happens when deep nature swerves into the territory of the alien, the at first glance unnatural, only to be recuperated into a redefined natural, a nature that can embrace the alien by bringing it into the family. And I'll argue here that a new vision of the sea is coming into being in marine biology, and particularly in marine microbiology, in genres that focus on extreme loving, that is, extremophilic microbes, like hyperthermophiles of the sort we just met. As scientists try to make sense of microbes at extremes of temperature, pressure, and in realms usually out of sight and out of reach, the subvisible world, the deep sea, and as I'll talk about later on, areas outside national sovereignties, a novel nature is in the making, which in Alien Ocean, I call the Alien Ocean. So for centuries, of course, the ocean has been limbed, particularly by Europeans, as an extreme kind of nature. For Christian Europeans, it was a feared vestige of a primordial chaos, host to demonic monsters, the remnant of Noah's flood. For medieval and early modern seafarers, it became a wilderness against which sailors might test their faith and their mettle. and with the Romantics, it was configured as an element with which lone individuals might seek to merge, reconnecting with an ocean now imagined as the nourishing matrix of life itself. By the middle of the 19th century, the ocean had become a symbol of the sublime, of the awesomely beautiful and terrifying, of the natural that exists on such a scale as to suggest that it partakes of something supernatural. Freud's oceanic feeling, his name for a human nostalgia for communion with the universe, draws on this sentiment, though also adds a fear of slipping into the undertow of the id, into the slime that hides inside the sublime. These symbolic renderings of the sea find a juridical history beginning in 1609, when Hugo Grotius designated swaths of the sea outside political dominion as the high seas, a framing that secures the idea that the ocean is the wildest nature that there is. The alien ocean, I suggest, emerges from such historical visions of the sea as chaos, wilderness, mother, other, sublime, slime, and frontier. But it also operates in an additional register in which the science-fictional symbolism of high technology and extraterrestriality are central. The extremophilic microbes at the center of my tale of the alien ocean are made legible by scientists in a biotechnological idiom, in a frame that has organisms propagating their kind in subaqueous webs or networks of genetic information. The network of genes that Penny Chisholm writes about. And many of the microbiologists I know believe marine extremophiles are potential analogs of life as it might exist elsewhere, in such ecologies as the ice-covered ocean of Jupiter's moon, Europa, or in the subterranean seas that may exist on Mars. So let me take you further into the territories of the alien ocean. I'm going to examine how scientists struggle to map relations between hyperthermophiles and other earthly creatures, particularly in a representational scheme that evolutionary biologists call the tree of life. I'll interpret scientists' dreams of turning extremophiles into profitable biotechnology, hopes that get me into the politics of deep-sea locales, where many vent creatures are found, outside of national territories, extraterritorial. And I'll conclude with thoughts about marine microbes as analogs for extraterrestrial life, making quite literal my claim that scientists are imagining Earth's oceans in the image of the alien. So let me tell you first then how marine microbiologists tell the story of vent microbes. So I'm moving here to how the scientists tell the story rather than how it's popularly represented, which is how we opened. I'll tell you the story as it's related to me by my informants, many of whom were part of the generation that discovered these creatures in the 1970s. When vent hyperthermophiles were first described, biologists were intrigued by their apparent genetic uniqueness. And some argued that they might represent a class of their own, and that their ancestors might be aboriginal forms of life. What was remarkable here is their resurrection of the idea that the sea might harbor living fossils, a notion that had previously been written off as a fanciful Jules Verne conceit with little basis in biology. The naming of the new microbes, however, already tilted discussion in this kind of lost world direction. In 1990, microbiologist Carl Woese gathered organisms like hypothermic microbes found at vents into a new taxonomic level above the level of the kingdom, which he called the level of the domain. And he gave hypothermophilic microbes and their similars a deliciously Lovecraftian name, the archaea, which means ancient ones. And in making this move, Woese argued that phylogenies, that is, family trees, guided by fine-grained molecular genetic techniques, revealed archaea to be a high-level biotic category, along with bacteria and eukarya. So he offered in his 1990 publication on this matter a new tree of life, which had three primary branches: bacteria, archaea and eukarya. And this was a genealogy that he conjured that was based on genes, on the genes of contemporary creatures imagined as analogs for their ancestors. So in his article on this, Toward a Natural System of Organisms, in which he proposed these domains, he made an explicit nod to Charles Darwin, who used this term, natural system. Charles Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, quote, "I believe that the element of descent is the hidden bond of connection which naturalists have sought under the term of the natural system," unquote. So prior to Darwin, natural scientists were trying to arrange various taxonomies of organisms and had lots and lots of different principles that they used to do so. Warm-bloodedness, cold-bloodedness, whether they're quadrupeds, all these kinds of things. But Darwin said, I believe the element of descent, ancestry, right, is the hidden bond of connection, which naturalists have sought under the term of the natural system, unquote. So for Carl Woese and his allies, genealogy would provide the anchoring outlines of natural categories. Genealogy equals nature in this way of thinking. Woese's approach to making sense of chemosynthetic extremophilic microbes was to place them in the deep past, where they could be seen to share with terrestrial creatures not just earthly history, but evolutionary kinship. Vent hypothermophiles represented the most conserved forms of life on the planet, links back to the root of what evolutionary biologists call the tree of life. That diagrammatic structure linking together all living things on Earth in a great genealogical branching. And here is Charles Darwin's famous figure from On the Origin of Species, in which he tries to formalize what such a representation might look like. So just as in the Volcanoes of the Deep Sea film, the idea was that genetic information, or what the film colorfully called the language of DNA, provided the code in which all the history of life on Earth was written. So on Carl Woese's reading, the code for archaea was the most ancient. Exactly the opposite. And that idea that archaea were ancient found support from scientists who believed that the early Earth was dotted with hydrothermal ecologies, that there were reasons to believe that life actually began in the pre-oxygen period of Earth's past, during the Archean era. Some scientists took matters further, suggesting that hypothermophilic life may have originated on an ancient oceanic Mars and then been conveyed to Earth in meteorites. A few of these scientists delight in saying that that would mean that, quote, we are all Martians, unquote. A statement whose uncanniness depends upon believing that biogenetic genealogy confers identity, which, as any anthropologist will tell you, is only one way of understanding kinship. Adoption, baptism, the list of other possibilities goes on. But anyway, the main point is that hypothermophilic microbes looked like they might provide a direct line to the root of the tree of life. But my fieldwork taught me that things were not quite that simple. When I met microbiologist Ed DeLong in his offices in Monterey Bay, he revealed that there was uncertainty about how to interpret the genetic distinctness of the archaea, and it stemmed precisely from using archaea's genes to locate them on the tree of life. As it happens, finding genes that lead back to ancestral destinations, so I'll go back to maybe this one, finding genes that lead back from the present to ancestral destinations requires particular kinds of genes. Genes that accumulate mutations at a constant rate. Genes that are sheltered from the vicissitudes of natural selection and which can therefore act as what geneticists call molecular clocks. So Carl Woese argued that a complex of genes that coded for replication, transcription, and translation, a complex that he called the cell's, quote, information processing system, unquote, he argued that that part of the genome was a good candidate for such a chronometer, reasoning that since its function is so fundamental, it's not likely to change much over time. So note what's going on here. Organisms are being described as information processing devices. The so-called language of DNA is being imagined as a kind of computer code. But Ed DeLong told me that when researchers tried to corroborate family trees of archaea by choosing genes other than those related to the information processing systems, the resulting trees were contradictory. Researchers were starting to believe that the genes contained in microbes like archaea, and also in bacteria too, by the way, may not be behaving in a predictable generation-to-generation way. It may be difficult to build trees because microbes may be exchanging genetic information, including in the so-called core information processing system portion of the genome. They may be exchanging genetic information with their contemporaries. So in addition to genes being passed down generations, they are also being mixed up within generations in a kind of rhizomatic way through a process called lateral gene transfer. So discerning that I was unusually interested in this scrambling of genealogical signals, underwriting evolutionary notions of relatedness, Ed DeLong handed me a paper by a microbiologist named Ford Doolittle. That's his name. This is a 1999 article from Science entitled Phylogenetic Classification and the Universal Tree. Doolittle argued that, so this is his representation of Carl Woese's tree with a few modifications, but there's going to be more after that. After this, he's already indicated that there is lateral gene transfer from bacteria into eukarya. So the lateral gene transfer that we know that was already kind of known about between bacteria and eukarya were chloroplasts from bacteria into plants, and mitochondria from single-celled bacteria into eukaryotes like ourselves. So that was already kind of a known symbiogenetic transfer. But Doolittle argued that molecular phylogenetics might reveal that one cannot do phylogeny for microbes at all because lateral gene transfer may swamp tree-like connections. And as he phrased it in this article in Science, the tree of life would turn out to be a net of life. He wrote, quote, "If different genes give different trees, and there's no fair way to suppress this disagreement, then a species or a phylum can belong to many genera or kingdoms at the same time. There really can be no universal phylogenetic tree of organisms based on such a reduction to genes," unquote. And so he offered that once this lateral gene transfer was taken into account, the picture might look more like this. So I'll read his quotation again. "If different genes give different trees, and there is no fair way to suppress this disagreement, then a species or phylum can belong to many genera or kingdoms at the same time. There really can be no universal phylogenetic tree of organisms based on such a reduction to genes," unquote. So there's kind of an incredible irony here, right? Which was that, as Charles Darwin said, the element of descent is going to be the key to the natural system. The element of descent becomes understood through DNA, and the idea is that, well, once we get the DNA really, really clear, everything will be fine. Everything will be sorted out. But in fact, what happened is getting the DNA clearer and clearer led to a much messier and reticulated and rhizomatic picture, much less like the tree of life. So much for the genealogical origin of species. Life is at sea here rather than in trees. There's a historical parallel with 19th century biology. Thomas Huxley, a key advocate of Darwin's, believed, so I'm going back to the 19th century now for an analogy. Thomas Huxley, a key advocate of Darwin's, believed that the sea floor was covered in a primordial ooze, a substance that he called Urschleim, after Ernst Haeckel, who was also in this conversation. This substance, collected on the voyage of Britain's HMS Challenger in the 1870s, turned out, however, to be a precipitate of calcium sulfate, which is an artifact of storing deep-sea mud in bottles filled with alcohol. So there was no Urschleim, contra to what Haeckel and Huxley believed. It was an artifact, right, of the medium. So archaea as a primordial organism might also be seen as an artifact of the belief that the deep sea must represent life's originary matrix, and more technically, of the commitment to the idea that genetic information constitutes an unproblematic signal of evolutionary origin. More colloquially, that information is thicker than water. The genealogy jumbling work of gene transfer is thick in marine environments, since, as one microbiologist has put it, quote, given the very high concentrations of bacteria and viruses in seawater and the tremendous volume of water in the ocean, it follows that gene transfer between organisms takes place about 20 million billion times per second in the oceans, unquote. So as ultimate paths back to the origin of life in hydrothermal vents have been obscured, rhetorics of alien origins have shifted sideways. Rather than pointing back to, say, Mars, hypothermophiles, as agents of lateral gene transfer, are now described as installing alienness at many points in the tree of life. Discussing lateral sources of genome diversity, microbiologist Eric Baptiste writes of, quote, the substitution of a resident gene by an alien version, unquote. And a University of Arizona team names such dynamics, quote, alien gene acquisition, unquote. Genes become alien visitors, inhabiting and continuously reprogramming the logics of life from within. Well, scientists fretted about shoring up the tree representation, and Doolittle and Carl Woese had big fights about whether, how much trouble lateral gene transfer could make for taxonomy. So while scientists fretted about shoring up the tree representation for the history of life on Earth, the trouble caused by lateral gene transfer found another unexpected interested audience: creationists. Some of the most avid readers of Ford Doolittle's work are religious thinkers of the intelligent design school, who interpret his questioning of the genealogical model as undermining evolutionary theory itself, which is not what Ford Doolittle meant to do. Molecular biologist and doctor of theology Jonathan Wells of the Discovery Institute, a nonprofit association in Seattle that promotes, quote, belief in God-given reason and the permanency of human nature, unquote, writes, quote, 10 years ago, molecular biologists were hopeful that DNA studies would confirm Darwin's tree of life. But as they compared more and more genes, it became clear that relationships among the major kingdoms of life are a tangled thicket. Darwinists simply assume that all organisms are related through common descent, because to admit otherwise opens the door to the possibility of divine creation and design, unquote. I talked to Ford Doolittle about this, and he was just apoplectic. But it's interesting, right, that it's open to that interpretation. So for Wells, if descent doesn't work the way evolutionists thought, it's more evidence of God's creation. In the place of category-busting, nature-denaturing aliens that worry scientists, then, we have supernatural agency. Secular scientists, seeking to fine-tune their categories of the natural by using genealogy to ground natural classification, find instead that their categories denature and unravel. Unwilling to claim that this puts their science in the realm of the unnatural, they worry about aliens, about things that do not quite fit, that transmit information from unexpected channels. Such scientists seek to wedge this story back into the realm of naturalistic meaning. And they do that, perhaps paradoxically, in the idiom of the artificial, namely biotechnology. What turns out to be interesting to scientists, then, is less what microbes are, taxonomically, who they are, than what it is that they do, namely live in extreme environments. So recall that the most famous archaea thrive on hydrogen sulfide, which is poisonous to most living things. This compound is also a toxic waste of power industries. Some scientists are excited about archaea's ability to break down hydrogen sulfide, making them of interest in bioremediation, cleaning up the biosphere. Enzymes derived from vent microbes are also of interest for gene amplification, the process which requires high temperatures of making genetic biomass for experimental purposes. This is done during the polymerase chain reaction, PCR. So New England biolabs recently isolated one of these enzymes from the Gulf of California, cloned it, and sold it as deep vent, trademark, advertised with the slogan, thermostability, fidelity, and versatility from the ocean depths. So they become bioproducts, right? These archaea then are linked not just to other organisms through gene transfer, but to new kinds of high-tech capitalism. As one biotechnologist said to me, quote, natural genetic engineering is very common, unquote. So listen to that. Nature is no longer the master classifier, but is rather an engineer. If 19th century visions of the sea as sublime slime have the ocean as, in the words of Chris Connery, quote, not simply a nutritive outside, but a reorganized, chaotic version of the body itself, where bones, blood marrow, and human energy are simply divided up and redistributed among the various life elements of the sea, unquote, then 21st century portraits of information-scrambling microbes pitch this vision in a technological language. No longer Mother Ocean, but the sea as DNA database. In these roiling waters, scientists who seek to launch marine biotech businesses must still get hold of vent archaea. And this runs them up against another place where the outlines of nature and life are contested, in this case, politically contested. Many vent microbes, because of their deep-sea habitat, are not found within the aquatic territory of any nation-state. Many vent locations fall outside exclusive economic zones, areas extending 200 nautical miles off the shores of terrestrial nations, making them alien not just in a fanciful science fiction sense, but also as citizen creatures. The extraterritoriality of vent microbes is potent, particularly for an American frontiering imagination, which sees spaces outside national jurisdiction as ripe for appropriation. It should be no surprise that the United States has not yet ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which names the seabed the common heritage of humankind. In 2005, I attended a meeting at the UN dedicated to puzzling through the disposition of resources outside national sovereignty. So this was an event that was titled Bioprospecting of Genetic Resources in the Deep Seabed, Scientific, Legal, and Policy Aspects. And delegates at this meeting debated whether there should be some kind of benefit-sharing regime created to distribute the wealth generated from biotech products using vent resources. Discussion turned on the question of whether vent fauna belonged to the seabed or to the water column, to which two different legal regimes pertain. So, things on the seabed, and minerals are what has often been under discussion here. Things on the seabed are considered, according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, are considered part of the common heritage of humankind after late 1960s decisions regarding benefit sharing for manganese nodule mining. And so there's a body called the International Seabed Authority, which is meant to distribute resources from any kinds of products or monies made from the extraction of resources in the deep seabed in areas outside of exclusive economic zones. So things on the seabed have been considered part of the common heritage of humankind. But entities in the water column, so let me fill up the ocean now. This is one of those things where you suck all the water out of the ocean and you can see the bottom. So let me just fill it up. So entities in the water column, which are things in the high seas, things like tuna fish and other creatures, entities in the water column are, to use the phrase in a literal sense, fair game, so long as they are outside exclusive economic zones. So where do hydrothermal vent critters fit in? Are they part of the seabed, or are they part of the high seas? And the UN position paper that I just showed you the cover of summarized, quote, "It is unclear." It is, quote, "It is unclear whether the living resources, or more particularly genetic resources, of oceanic ridges and the seabed in general would fall under the regime of the seabed or that of the high seas." So, is it this or is it this? Is it the seabed or is it the high seas? One delegate suggested that the lack of clarity followed from the nature of chemosynthesis, which mixed the mineral with the microbial. Hypothermophiles making use of minerals from the seabed and oxygen from the water column might, he suggested, confound the whole open access common heritage parsing, requiring a rewriting of segments of the convention. So once again, categories that were thought to be natural, in this case the seabed versus the water column, although they're obviously very legibly legal for these actors, are disturbed by close examination of microbial life, again alien to received categories. Now we're going to go to space. Jupiter's ice-covered satellite, Europa, maybe some of you have been there, maybe not, has been a staple in science fiction about living things on other worlds. The moon features in Arthur C. Clarke's 2010 as an aqueous cradle for new life in the solar system. And Europa makes a spectacular appearance at the end of another James Cameron IMAX film about the deep sea called Aliens of the Deep. And let's see. So continuing his obsession with things abyssal, and I'll show you this clip in a moment, James Cameron, in this production, this movie, which came out after the Volcanoes of the Deep movie, in this production he leads the viewer on a kind of gee whiz tour of hydrothermal vents, posed in the film explicitly as analogs for extraterrestrial ecologies. And where Volcanoes followed senior research scientists, for Aliens, Cameron casts a crew of graduate students. And if you watch this film, they exude youthful exuberance as they descend in their bubble submersibles, borrowed from the film from Russian oceanographers. Uniformed in jumpsuits emblazoned with the words "extreme life," these graduate students spend much of the movie dispensing such phrases as "that's absolutely unreal" or "that's like another planet." Beyond struggling to place their surrounds within an earthly real or natural, they're often so overwhelmed by their presence in the deep sea that they have a hard time speaking in the present tense. Looking out of the high-tech sub is like a glimpse back in time, or something that leaves them feeling transported into the future. So, and at the end of the film, we viewers are transported through the magic of computer graphics to the waters below the ice of Europa. And let me show you a clip of this film, which spins a scientifically minded but resolutely science-fictional yarn about the natural, the unexpected, and perhaps the supernatural.
It would be possible to explore oceans on another world. So, getting an idea of what it's like to explore these extreme environments on our own planet could very well pave the way to exploring Europa.
This is a geology, biology graduate student narrating this.
A mission to explore under the ice of Europa would be the ultimate robotic challenge. During the landing, the team in mission control would pretty much be along for the ride. At the speed of light, it would take more than an hour for the command just to reach the vehicle. It's really on its own. It has to be smart enough to avoid terrain hazards and to find a good landing site on the ice. torpedo. The ice could be anywhere from 3 to 16 miles deep. Week after week, the melt probe will sink of its own weight through the ancient ice. Until finally, what are you going to do when you reach the surface of that ocean? You need an AUV, an autonomous underwater vehicle. It needs to be one smart puppy, able to navigate and make decisions on its own in an alien ocean. Has internal heat. It may well have hydrothermal venting. If it does, and if the chemistry is right,
this is a superimposition of footage from hydrothermal vents and something else.
It will have an enormous impact on humanity if we find life in an ocean on another world. But in order to find it, we have to go there. And to go there, we have to continue the journey here. Exploration is like a muscle. You have to exercise it to make it stronger. And if water is the common ingredient for life, we need to take what we know about deep ocean exploration and apply it to space, giving scientists and explorers the experience they'll need to follow the water, wherever it might be.
Discovering life at the vents shows us that nature has more to teach us than we can possibly imagine. But I wonder, what would it be like if we were exploring the ocean on another world?
So she's a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara who studies hydrothermal vents.
It might completely change our definition of life. Let's see what they do.
These are actual graduate students. Not computer generated.
Right on.
Houston Endurance, we have arrived on stationary coordinates, and we have some new friends.
All right, that's a little too much. That's the end of the movie. It's too much fun. We can't have that much fun. So here the camera pulls back to reveal the home of our friendly extraterrestrials. A gleaming metropolis, a glowing Atlantis, a Neptunian Jerusalem, a bioluminescent manifestation of the technological sublime, an underwater city on a hill, populated by what look like aquatic angels. This alien ocean offers a utopia, a place where creatures commune across interplanetary difference. This alien ocean is delivered as a transcendent paradise. The natural, encountered elsewhere, spirals up to intimate the existence of a higher order or system. This dizzy rhetorical work shores up a particular version of the natural, of a cosmic, harmoniously organized nature. There's an echo here of the narrative fate of the strange gene-trading deep-sea microbe. When scientists sought to fit those creatures into existing taxonomies, motivated by a faith that nature was harmoniously organized, they found themselves having to rethink the boundaries, their categories of what counted as natural, citing such apparitions as alien genes along the way. Ultimately, they renaturalized lateral gene transfer as a kind of natural genetic engineering, and indeed sought to put vent microbes to work in such eco-friendly practices as cleaning up oil spills. The new nature of biotech would not be so different from the old nature. Both would be on the side of order, of cleaning up messes. In the last scene of Aliens of the Deep, the aliens are also tamed, signs not of chaos, but of a perfect order, even, like their microbial avatars in Earth's oceans, an order of perfectly engineered technological accomplishment. But this is an ambivalent order, signaled by the language of alienness that suffuses discussions of microbial worlds in the sea. Microbes' status as novel scientific objects and as objects of wonder and anxiety makes science fiction an inviting vernacular in which to describe them. In other words, aliens are strangers, entities not yet, or not fully ever, friend or enemy, self or other. Stealing a phrase from Stuart Hall, the alien could be glossed as constituted by, quote, difference which is not pure otherness, unquote. This alien operates on a sliding scale from the globe to the gene, with a stopover at the human. Let me conclude with thoughts about the ocean first, and then about the human. Ocean. The alien ocean is neither fully a realm of perfect order, nor a dystopia of miring confusion, but would better be imagined as what Michel Foucault calls a heterotopia. Heterotopias are constantly shimmering into solid existence. They are sites where the social order is simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. They are, quote, capable of juxtaposing in a single place several spaces, several sites that are themselves incompatible, unquote. Foucault names the world of the sailing ship, with its overstated installations of landed social hierarchies, think Royal Navy, and its inversions of everyday life, think pirates, as a heterotopia par excellence. My notion of the alien ocean tips Foucault's microcosmic heterotopia into the wider sea, finding today's heterogeneous microbial ocean to be a fitting example and symbol of the representations, contestations, and inversions that crisscross the very possibility of holding steady our categories of natural, unnatural, and supernatural. What of the human? By the time I finished the research and writing for Alien Ocean, descriptions of human bodies as, like the surface of the planet, 70% salty water, were being edged out by pronouncements like this one from microbiologist Joe Handelsman, quote, we have 10 times more bacteria in our cells, bacterial cells in our bodies than human cells, so we're 90% bacteria, unquote. Once upon a time, the human plunged into the sea as blood, sweat, tears, and milk was baptized into communion with the planet. But plunged into the sea as a swirl of microbial genes, something more unsettling happens. Microbes are not echoes of a left-behind origin for humans. Microbes are historical and contemporary partners, part of our body's microbiomes. The bacteria that inhabit our bodies do not simply mirror the bacteria that inhabit the sea, though in some ways they do, particularly in representations like this, where the fluorescence microscopic image of human gut microbes, and the fluorescence microscopic image of marine microbes look a lot alike. But this is not simply human nature reflecting ocean nature. It's an entanglement of natures, intimacy with aliens, not Homo sapiens, but Homo alien. The microbial sea, then, may not so much underwrite a unity of the human with the oceanic as this, the saturation of human nature by other natures. Life is at sea. Thanks.